At 21:13 on the evening of May 29th, 1944, Captain Lieutenant Detlev Krankenhagen stood in the control room of U-549, watching his hydrophone operator's face. They were 500 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, approximately 300 miles northwest of the Canary Islands. The hydrophone operator's expression had just changed. The rhythmic pinging of American sonar had stopped moving in a search pattern. It had locked on. Krankenhagen knew what came next. He had survived depth charge attacks before. The American destroyer escort above would sprint forward, lose sonar contact in the final approach, and drop charges blindly based on where U-549 had been, not where she was. The standard evasion was textbook. Wait for the destroyer to pass overhead, turn hard to port or starboard as the pinging stopped, change depth rapidly, and slip away while the depth charges exploded uselessly in empty water. Except this time, something was different. The sonar ping remained locked on his position. The American ship above was not accelerating. It was slowing down, maintaining contact. Then Krankenhagen heard the sound, not the splash of depth charges falling from stern racks, something else. Multiple impacts on the water's surface, 200 meters ahead and above, all arriving simultaneously. 24 distinct splashes in rapid succession, forming a circular pattern. His hydrophone operator reported it immediately. Multiple objects entering the water, sinking, fast, much faster than depth charges. Krankenhagen had approximately 45 seconds before those objects reached his submarine's depth. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He did not know. He was the first U-boat commander in the Atlantic to face a fully coordinated Hedgehog attack from a destroyer escort equipped with integrated sonar fire control. He did not know that the projectiles descending toward him were sinking at 23 feet per second, 3 times faster than conventional depth charges. He did not know that USS Eugene E. Elmore's sonar operator was tracking his exact position continuously, feeding targeting data directly to the Hedgehog launcher. He did not know that the projectiles would only explode on direct contact with his submarine's hull. All Krankenhagen knew was that his evasion tactics, refined through months of combat experience, were suddenly obsolete. But the Americans were maintaining sonar contact during the attack. They weren't guessing where he would be. They were watching where he was, and whatever was descending through the water column above him was coming very, very fast. 45 seconds is not enough time to change everything. It's barely enough time to understand that everything has changed. The Battle of the Atlantic had been fought for nearly 5 years. By May 1944, German U-boats had sunk over 3,000 Allied merchant ships and hundreds of warships. They had nearly strangled Britain's supply lines in 1942 and 1943, but by May 1944, the balance had shifted. Allied technology, tactics, and industrial capacity had created weapons and systems that U-boat commanders did not understand and could not counter. The Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar was one of those weapons. Developed by the British Royal Navy's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development in 1941, the Hedgehog represented a fundamental rethinking of anti-submarine warfare. Traditional depth charges suffered from a critical flaw. They exploded at preset depths, whether they hit the submarine or not. This created massive underwater explosions that disrupted sonar contact for minutes, allowing submarines to escape while the attacking ship was temporarily blind. Depth charges also had to be dropped from the stern after the attacking ship passed over the submarine. This created a blind period during the final approach when sonar could no longer track the target. U-boat commanders like Krankenhagen had become expert at exploiting that blind period, executing sharp turns and depth changes in the seconds when Allied ships could no longer see them. The Hedgehog eliminated both problems. Mounted on the foredeck, it fired 24 spigot mortar projectiles forward, ahead of the attacking ship, while sonar contact remained intact. The projectiles landed in a circular pattern approximately 130 feet in diameter, about 200 yards ahead of the ship. Each projectile weighed 65 pounds and carried a 35-pound Torpex explosive charge. The critical innovation was the contact fuse. Hedgehog projectiles only exploded if they struck something solid, a submarine hull, a direct hit. If they missed, they sank silently to the ocean floor without detonating. This meant attacking ships could maintain sonar contact throughout the entire engagement. No massive explosions churning the water, no acoustic blackout, just continuous tracking, continuous firing, continuous attacks until the submarine was hit or escaped beyond sonar range. The mathematics of the Hedgehog were brutal. 24 projectiles falling in a 130-foot circle, a Type 9C C-40 U-boat, like U-549, measured 251 feet long and 22 feet wide. The Hedgehog pattern was designed to bracket a submarine's probable position. At least some projectiles would likely strike the hull if the initial targeting was accurate, and the projectiles sank fast. At a rate of 23 feet per second, they would reach 200 feet depth in approximately 9 seconds. At 400 feet depth, where most U-boats cruise during evasion, the projectiles arrived in about 17 seconds. At 600 feet depth, near the maximum operating depth for many U-boats, the Hedgehog projectiles reached the target in approximately 26 seconds. U-549 was at 500 feet. When the Hedgehogs entered the water, Krankenhagen had approximately 22 seconds before impact. He had ordered a turn to port and a depth change to 600 feet. The U-boats rated test depth, attempting the standard evasion that had worked against depth charges, but depth charges gave warning. They exploded at preset depths, creating concussive shock waves that U-boat crews could hear coming. Hedgehogs were silent until impact. There was no warning, no thunder of explosions getting closer. Just silence, and then catastrophe. Kapitän-Leutnant Detlev Krankenhagen was 31 years old. He had joined the Kriegsmarine in 1932 and had been assigned to U-boat service in 1940. He assumed his first command, U-549, on July 14, 1943. The submarine had been commissioned that same day at Hamburg's Deutsche Werft shipyard. For 10 months, Krankenhagen and his crew of 57 men had trained together through the Baltic Sea shakedown period and their first Atlantic patrol. They had departed Kiel in January 1944, transited through the gap between Iceland and the Faroe Islands, and spent 2 months patrolling the mid-Atlantic without success. No Allied ships sunk, no victories. They had returned to Lorient in March with nothing to show for the patrol except survival. Their second patrol began on May 14, 1944. Krankenhagen received orders to operate in the waters northwest of the Canary Islands, hunting for Allied convoys heading toward the Mediterranean to support the Allied advance through Italy. U-549 departed Lorient's massive concrete submarine pens and headed southwest into the Atlantic. For 2 weeks, they found nothing. The ocean was vast, and Allied routing was unpredictable. Convoys changed course based on intelligence. Hunter-killer groups prowled known U-boat transit routes. Aircraft patrolled from bases in Britain, Iceland, and North Africa. Finding targets required patience, luck, and aggressive searching. On the evening of May 29th, Krankenhagen's patience paid off. At 2013 hours, while submerged at periscope depth, he sighted an American escort carrier surrounded by destroyer escorts, Task Group 21.11. Though Krankenhagen did not know its designation, he recognized the carrier's silhouette, a Bogue-class escort carrier, smaller than fleet carriers, but still a high-value target. Carriers were rare opportunities for U-boat commanders by 1944. Most operated far from U-boat patrol zones, protected by multiple screening vessels and aircraft. This carrier was vulnerable. Krankenhagen positioned U-549 for attack. He closed to approximately 1,000 meters and fired 3 T-3 torpedoes at 2013 hours. The firing solution was perfect. 2 torpedoes struck USS Block Island amidships. The carrier began listing immediately. She would sink 2 hours later. Krankenhagen had just achieved what would be the only sinking of an American escort carrier by a U-boat in the Atlantic theater during the entire war. But there was no time to celebrate. The destroyer escorts surrounding Block Island immediately began searching for the attacking submarine. Krankenhagen ordered U-549 to dive deep and turn away at maximum submerged speed. At 2040 hours, he fired a second salvo of acoustic homing torpedoes at the destroyer escorts attempting to track him. One torpedo struck USS Barr near the stern, severely damaging the ship and killing 4 crew members. The attack was tactically sound. Strike the carrier, damage the escorts, escape in the confusion. It had worked for U-boat aces throughout the war. But by May 1944, American anti-submarine tactics had evolved beyond what German doctrine anticipated. The destroyer escorts of Task Group 21.11 were purpose-built submarine hunters. They were smaller than fleet destroyers, but faster and more maneuverable than corvettes. They carried the latest sonar equipment, including the Type 144Q attachment sonar that could determine not just range and bearing, but also depth. They carried Hedgehog launchers integrated with fire control systems that calculated attack solutions automatically, and their crews had trained specifically for hunter-killer operations. Finding and destroying submarines was their only mission. USS Eugene E. Elmore was one of those destroyer escorts, a cannon-class ship commissioned in December 1943, just 5 months old. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander G.L. Conkey, had drilled his crew relentlessly on anti-submarine tactics. When Block Island was hit, Elmore was approximately 8,000 meters away, screening the carrier's southern approach. Conkey immediately turned toward the torpedo origin point and increased speed. Elmore's sonar operators began sweeping the area systematically. At 2102 hours, with Block Island sinking and USS Aaron stopped in the water to rescue survivors, Elmore's sonar made contact. A solid return. Range 4,000 yards, bearing 275 degrees. Submerged contact, moving slowly at depth. Conkey ordered his ship to close slowly, maintaining sonar contact. This was critical. Rushing in would create noise that might break the sonar lock. Slow, steady approaches kept the submarine pinned down, unable to determine the exact position of the attacker until it was too late to evade effectively. By 21:13 hours, Elmore had closed to 1,000 meters. The sonar contact remained solid. Conkey ordered the Hedgehog attack. The launcher, mounted on Elmore's foredeck, elevated slightly. 24 spigot mortars aimed forward at varying angles. The firing mechanism activated. In less than 2 seconds, all 24 projectiles fired in sequence, the highest trajectory rounds first, the flattest trajectory rounds last. This ensured all projectiles entered the water simultaneously, despite their different flight paths. The pattern splashed down 200 yards ahead of Elmore's bow, forming a circle 130 feet in diameter, directly over where sonar showed U-549. Inside the submarine, Krankenhagen heard the splashes. He ordered emergency depth change to 600 feet and hard turn to port. The submarine's diesels were silent. Electric motors drove the propellers. Every non-essential system shut down to reduce noise. The crew moved carefully, knowing that drop tools or loud voices could be detected by the American sonar above. But it didn't matter. Elmore's sonar tracked the turn, the depth change, the exact position. The hydrophone operator aboard U-549 reported to Krankenhagen that the American sonar ping remained locked on. It wasn't sweeping, it wasn't searching, it was fixed, tracking continuously. That should not have been possible during an attack. The first Hedgehog salvo missed. 24 projectiles sank past U-549's hull without making contact. They continued descending silently to the ocean floor 2,000 feet below. But Elmore maintained sonar contact. There had been no explosions to disrupt the acoustic conditions, no debris field obscuring the target, just clear, continuous tracking. Conkey ordered his crew to reload the Hedgehog launcher. Reloading took 3 minutes. 3 minutes, during which U-549 continued attempting to evade. Krankenhagen ordered another course change, starboard turn, depth change back to 450 feet, maximum silent speed. But Elmore's sonar followed every maneuver. The integrated fire control system adjusted the targeting solution automatically based on the submarine's movements. At 21:16 hours, 3 minutes after the first attack, Elmore fired a second Hedgehog salvo. 24 more projectiles entered the water, forming another circular pattern. This pattern was calculated not for where U-549 had been, but for where she was now, based on continuous sonar tracking. The projectiles sank at 23 feet per second. Krankenhagen heard them entering the water. He heard them descending through the acoustic medium. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that his standard evasion tactics were not working. 30 seconds after the second salvo was fired, 3 Hedgehog projectiles struck U-549's hull. The first hit near the forward torpedo room. The contact fuse detonated 35 pounds of Torpex explosive directly against the pressure hull. The explosion punched a hole approximately 4 inches in diameter through the hardened steel plating. At 500 feet depth, water pressure was approximately 220 pounds per square inch. Water began entering the forward compartment at approximately 400 gallons per minute. The second projectile struck amidships near the control room. The explosion ruptured the pressure hull and destroyed electrical systems. Lights failed, emergency lighting activated, control surfaces lost hydraulic pressure. The third projectile struck the after torpedo room. The explosion killed 6 crew members instantly and flooded the compartment within seconds. U-549 began sinking. Krankenhagen ordered all ballast tanks blown to emergency surface, but the compressed air systems were damaged. The submarine could not arrest its descent. At 21:20 hours, 4 minutes after the fatal hits, Elmore's sonar operators heard a different sound, a prolonged, crushing implosion. U-549 had reached crush depth. The pressure hull, designed to withstand pressures up to 750 feet depth, failed catastrophically somewhere below 800 feet. The submarine imploded. The collapse was so rapid that water rushing inward exceeded the speed of sound in water. The crew died instantly, crushed by water pressure that compressed the hull into a fraction of its original volume. All 57 men aboard U-549 perished. Captain Lieutenant Detlev Krankenhagen, his first watch officer, the chief engineer, the torpedo men, the radio operators, the diesel mechanics, the hydrophone operator who had tracked the American sonar, the cook. The youngest crew members were 18 years old. The oldest was 42. None survived. Elmore circled the area for 20 minutes, maintaining sonar contact on the wreck, settling to the ocean floor. No air bubbles rose to the surface, no debris appeared, no survivors. The silence after the implosion was absolute. The submarine that had just sunk, America's only escort carrier, lost in the Atlantic, simply ceased to exist. Krankenhagen's achievement, torpedoing Block Island, would be recorded in German naval records, but Krankenhagen himself would never return to receive recognition. His crew would never tell their families about the successful attack. The Hedgehog had erased them from the war in less than 10 minutes from initial sonar contact to final implosion. This was the new mathematics of anti-submarine warfare in 1944. Not hours-long depth charge attacks where submarines might survive hundreds of explosions, but precise, deadly engagements where continuous tracking and contact-fused weapons left no room for evasion or survival. The development of the Hedgehog had begun 3 years earlier, in 1941, when the Battle of the Atlantic was going very badly for Britain. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than Britain could build replacements. In the first 6 months of 1941, U-boats sank over 1.6 million tons of Allied shipping. Convoy escorts were armed with depth charges and determination, but depth charges were fundamentally inefficient weapons. They were large steel drums, cylindrical or teardrop-shaped, filled with 300 to 600 pounds of explosive, most commonly amatol or Torpex. A hydrostatic fuse set before release would detonate the charge at a predetermined depth, typically between 100 and 600 feet. The explosion created a massive underwater shockwave intended to damage or destroy submarines through hydrostatic shock rather than direct impact. The problem was accuracy. During World War II, British Royal Navy ships launched 5,174 depth-charge attacks against U-boats. These attacks resulted in 85.5 kills. That's a ratio of 60 to 1. For every U-boat sunk, 60 depth-charge attacks failed. The failures had multiple causes. Submarines could evade during the blind period when attacking ships lost sonar contact. Depth settings could be wrong, causing charges to explode above or below the submarine. The massive explosions disrupted sonar for up to 30 minutes, preventing follow-up attacks until the water settled. And submarines were remarkably durable. German U-boats could survive tremendous punishment. U-427, for example, endured 678 depth charges over several hours in April 1945, before finally escaping damaged but intact. The British Admiralty knew it needed better weapons. In 1940, they established the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, quickly nicknamed the Wheezers and Dodgers, because many of its scientists and engineers were older men recalled from retirement or civilian life. The director was Lieutenant Commander Charles Goodeve, a Canadian-born scientist and naval officer. Goodeve's team received an urgent requirement: develop a forward-throwing anti-submarine weapon that could be fired while sonar contact remained intact. An earlier attempt, the Fairley mortar, had failed during trials, but the principle was sound. Fire projectiles ahead of the ship, not astern. Maintain sonar contact during the attack. Eliminate the blind period. Goodeve's team began work in early 1941. They faced multiple technical challenges. The weapon had to throw projectiles far enough ahead of the ship that they would land over the submarine's position while sonar still tracked it, approximately 200 yards. The projectiles had to sink fast enough that submarines couldn't evade during descent. They had to carry enough explosive to kill a submarine with a direct hit, and, critically, they needed a contact fuse that would survive the impact with the water's surface traveling at over 100 miles per hour, but then detonate reliably when striking a submarine's hull at depth. The fuse problem was extraordinarily difficult. The projectile would hit the water at tremendous velocity, creating a deceleration force of thousands of Gs. The fuse had to withstand that impact without detonating prematurely. But that once in the water, it had to arm itself and then detonate when striking the much softer impact of a submarine hull. Goodeve's team solved this through elegant engineering. The projectile's nose contained a lead weight that created stability during flight and water entry. Behind the lead weight was the contact fuse mechanism. On impact with water, a striker pin was held back by the inertia of the water impact. As the projectile stabilized and began sinking, a spring-loaded mechanism armed the fuse. If the projectile struck a submarine hull, the much gentler impact released the striker pin, detonating the explosive charge. If it struck soft ocean floor, the impact was absorbed and the fuse did not detonate. The shape of the projectile was also critical. Early prototypes skidded horizontally after hitting the water, creating unpredictable dispersal patterns. Goodeve's team discovered that a flat nose caused the projectile to stop skidding and sink vertically almost immediately. This gave them the consistent circular pattern they needed. The explosive charge required careful calculation. It had to be large enough to rupture a pressure hull with a direct hit, but small enough that 24 projectiles could be carried and fired from a single launcher. They settled on 35 pounds of Torpex per projectile. Torpex was 50% more powerful than TNT. A 35-pound Torpex charge would punch a 3 to 4 inch diameter hole through U-boat pressure hull plating. At depth, water would flood through that hole at hundreds of gallons per minute. One hit might not sink the submarine immediately. 2 hits almost certainly would. The launcher itself used the spigot mortar principle developed by Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker before the war. Instead of a traditional tube that the projectile fit inside, the spigot mortar used a steel rod projecting upward from a base plate. The projectile had a hollow tail tube that fit over the spigot, The propellant charge was in the base of the launcher, not in the projectile itself. When fired, the propellant exploded against the spigot, driving the projectile upward and forward off the spigot rod. This design allowed multiple projectiles of different sizes to be fired from the same launcher. More importantly, it was simple and reliable. 24 spigots, arranged in 6 rows of 4, each angled slightly differently to create the circular landing pattern. The entire launcher could be reloaded in 3 minutes by a trained crew. The first prototype was installed on HMS Westcott, a British destroyer, in May 1941. Testing began in Liverpool Bay against a known wreck on the ocean floor. The test was extraordinarily successful. Multiple projectiles struck the wreck. The contact fuses worked perfectly. The pattern was consistent and accurate. Production authorization came through 9 months later, in January 1942. By the late 1942, Hedgehog launchers were being installed on Royal Navy escorts throughout the Atlantic. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The first U-boat kill came in November 1942. HMS Westcott, the same destroyer that had tested the prototype, sank U-581 southwest of the Azores using Hedgehog, but initial success rates were disappointing. Through early 1943, Hedgehog attacks were achieving only about a 5% kill rate, barely better than depth charges. The problem wasn't the weapon, it was doctrine and training. Royal Navy captains and crews didn't trust the new system. Depth charges were familiar. They produced spectacular explosions that gave crews the psychological satisfaction of fighting back even if the submarine escaped. Hedgehogs were silent unless they hit. A miss produced no explosions, no visible effects, nothing to indicate the attack had occurred. This silence was psychologically difficult. Crews began avoiding Hedgehog attacks in favor of traditional depth charges, even though the statistics showed Hedgehogs were more effective. The Admiralty issued a directive in early 1943 ordering captains to report why they had not used Hedgehog on underwater contacts. This forced evaluation of the weapon's performance. The Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development sent training officers to escort bases, particularly Londonderry in Northern Ireland, where many escort groups were based. These officers conducted ship-wide briefings explaining exactly how Hedgehog worked, why silent misses were actually advantageous because they didn't disrupt sonar, and presenting detailed case studies of successful attacks. Training improved. Confidence increased. By mid-1944, Hedgehog kill rates had improved dramatically. Out of 268 Hedgehog attacks during the war, 47 resulted in confirmed U-boat kills. That's a ratio of less than 6-1. Compared to the 60-1 ratio for depth charges, Hedgehog was 11 times more effective per attack. The United States Navy adopted the Hedgehog in late 1942 through reverse lend-lease. American industrial capacity allowed rapid production. By 1943, newly commissioned American destroyer escorts were being fitted with Hedgehog as standard equipment. The American version, designated Mark 10 and Mark 11, incorporated improvements to the British design, better training procedures, integration with fire control systems, and, critically, integration with improved sonar systems like the Type 1 44Q attachment that could determine target depth. This integration transformed the Hedgehog from a good weapon into a devastating one. Sonar operators could track not just the submarine's position, but its exact depth. Fire control systems calculated the attack solution automatically, accounting for the submarine's course, speed, and depth. The launcher could be adjusted slightly for roll compensation and leading the target. When all these systems worked together, as they did aboard USS Eugene E. Elmore on May 29, 1944, the result was lethal precision. The statistics from late-war American operations were stark. 11 of the last 16 U-boat sinkings by United States Navy surface ships involved Hedgehog attacks. That's nearly 70%. By 1945, the Hedgehog had become the primary anti-submarine weapon for destroyer escorts operating in hunter-killer groups. The weapon's success came from understanding a fundamental principle. Information was more valuable than firepower. Depth charges were more powerful than Hedgehog projectiles. A 600-pound depth charge created a far larger explosion than a 35-pound Hedgehog bomb. But that power was wasted if the submarine wasn't there when the explosion occurred. The Hedgehog sacrificed explosive power for information. Continuous sonar tracking meant attacking ships always knew where the submarine was. Contact fuses meant projectiles only exploded on hits, so missed attacks didn't create acoustic interference. Fast sink rates meant submarines had less time to evade. These factors combined to create a weapon system where precision compensated for reduced individual projectile power. German U-boat commanders never fully understood what they were facing. Surviving U-boat officers interviewed after the war reported that Allied anti-submarine attacks became dramatically more effective in 1944. They attributed this to better sonar, more escorts, and improved coordination. They were correct about all of those factors, but they consistently underestimated the impact of the Hedgehog specifically. German naval intelligence knew the weapon existed, captured escorts and interrogated prisoners, provided descriptions. But German commanders didn't grasp the tactical revolution it represented. They continued teaching standard evasion procedures, sharp turns and depth changes to exploit the blind period during depth charge attacks, without understanding that the blind period no longer existed when facing Hedgehog-equipped ships. This failure of adaptation was institutional. The Kriegsmarine had developed anti-submarine evasion doctrine in the 1920s and 30s based on World War I experience. That doctrine assumed attacking ships would lose contact during the final approach. It assumed explosions would disrupt sonar. It assumed submarines could evade during that disruption. These assumptions were valid against depth charges. They were lethal against Hedgehogs. U-boat training schools continued teaching the old doctrine because it had worked for years. Individual commanders who survived Hedgehog attacks and might have recognized the new threat never returned to share their knowledge. They were dead, like Krankenhagen, or captured. The knowledge didn't propagate through the U-boat force. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was profound. Surviving U-boat sailors who experienced Hedgehog attacks and escaped described them as qualitatively different from depth charge attacks. Depth charges created thunder, massive explosions that could be heard throughout the submarine. The explosions were terrifying, but they were predictable. You heard them coming. You knew when each wave of charges detonated. You could count them and estimate how close they were. The attacks eventually ended when the escort ran out of charges or lost contact. Hedgehog attacks were silent. No explosions, unless projectiles hit. No warning, no countdown. Just the sound of objects entering the water, then silence, then either nothing or sudden catastrophic hull breach. The silence was worse than the noise. It meant the escorts still had sonar contact. They weren't guessing, they were tracking. And they would keep attacking until the submarine was dead or escaped beyond sonar range. One U-boat commander who survived multiple Hedgehog attacks in early 1945 described the experience in post-war interviews. He said the crew's morale collapsed during Hedgehog attacks in ways it never did during depth charge attacks. With depth charges, there was a sense of fighting, maneuvering, trying to outthink the escort commander. With Hedgehogs, there was just helplessness. The escort could see you. You couldn't see it. You could maneuver all you wanted. The sonar ping stayed locked on. And you knew that eventually one of those salvos would bracket your position and the silent projectiles would punch through your hull. Mathematics were inevitable. You would lose. It was just a question of when. The tactical evolution continued beyond the Hedgehog. In late 1943, the Royal Navy introduced the Squid, a 3-barrel depth charge mortar that automatically set charge depth based on sonar data. The Squid fired 390-pound charges in a triangular pattern, combined with Type 147 sonar that tracked depth automatically. Squid-equipped frigates achieved even higher kill rates than Hedgehog destroyers. By war's end, the principle was established. Forward-throwing weapons with automated fire control based on continuous sonar tracking were the future of anti-submarine warfare. The age of blind depth charge attacks was over. For the 57 men aboard U-549, these technological advances arrived as incomprehensible death. Krankenhagen had executed a perfect attack on Block Island. He had damaged an escort. He had evaded the initial searches. Everything according to doctrine. Everything by the book. And then, in 10 minutes, his submarine was gone. Not because of any mistake he made, not because of poor seamanship, but because Allied technology had advanced beyond German doctrine's ability to counter it. The 45 seconds between hearing the Hedgehogs enter the water and impact on the hull represented the gap between what U-boat commanders believed was possible and what was actually happening in the North Atlantic in 1944. USS Block Island sank at 22:57 hours on May 29th. Of the 957 men aboard, 6 were killed in the torpedo explosions. The remaining 951 were rescued by the destroyer escorts Ahrens and Robert the Fontaine. Block Island was the only American escort carrier sunk by U-boat action in the Atlantic during the entire war. Krankenhagen's attack had been historically significant, but significance requires someone to record it. The only witnesses to Krankenhagen's success were his own crew, and they died with him. German Naval Command received no radio report from U-549 after May 29th. The submarine was simply listed as missing, then overdue, then presumed lost. The Kriegsmarine never learned that U-549 had sunk Block Island. They never knew Krankenhagen had achieved one of the few U-boat successes of mid-1944. The victory was erased along with the crew. Elmore departed the attack site at 21:50 hours and rejoined the task group to assist USS Barr, which was barely staying afloat after being torpedoed. Elmore took Barr under tow and transferred wounded crew members for medical treatment. The 4 destroyer escorts and Block Island survivors reached Casablanca on June 1st. Elmore's action report credited the ship with sinking U-549 using Hedgehog, followed by depth charges. The report noted that sonar contact had been maintained throughout the entire engagement. The integration of sonar and Hedgehog fire control had functioned exactly as designed. Lieutenant Commander Conkey and his crew received commendations for the action, but there were no medals, no dramatic publicity. By mid-1944, sinking U-boats had become routine for American hunter-killer groups. The war continued. The last U-boat sunk by American forces using Hedgehog was U-853, destroyed on May 6, 1945, just hours before VE Day. U-853 had torpedoed the collier SS Black Point off Rhode Island on May 5th, the last American merchant ship sunk by U-boat action in American waters. Despite explicit orders from Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz to cease all attacks and return to port for surrender, U-853's commander, Oberleutnant Helmut Fromsdorf, had pressed the attack. Whether he never received the ceasefire order or simply ignored it, remains unknown. Fromsdorf and his crew died when USS Atherton and USS Moberly destroyed the submarine with coordinated Hedgehog and depth charge attacks in shallow water off Point Judith, Rhode Island. The entire crew of 55 men perished. The war in Europe ended the next day. The Battle of the Atlantic was won through accumulated advantages. No single weapon or technology defeated the U-boats. It was the combination of better radar, better sonar, better encryption braking, escort carriers providing air cover, long-range patrol aircraft, hunter-killer groups, improved depth charges, and weapons, like the Hedgehog, that collectively made U-boat operations unsustainable. But within that combination, the Hedgehog represented something profound. It represented the application of systematic thinking to warfare, the recognition that information and precision could compensate for raw firepower, that continuous tracking was more valuable than massive explosions, that eliminating an enemy's ability to exploit gaps in your sensor coverage was worth more than increasing your weapon yield. These principles extended beyond anti-submarine warfare. They anticipated precision-guided munitions, network-centric warfare, and the integration of sensors with weapons that would define late 20th century and 21st century military operations. The developers of the Hedgehog were not visionary futurists. They were pragmatic engineers solving an immediate problem. Allied merchant ships were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. Depth charges weren't working well enough. Something better was needed urgently. Lieutenant Commander Charles Goodeve and his team at the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development created the Hedgehog because they had to, not because they were pursuing some grand theoretical vision of future warfare. But their solution, born of necessity in 1941, established principles that proved fundamental. The weapon's success validated an approach to military technology that prioritized effectiveness over impressiveness. Hedgehog projectiles were small, 35 pounds of explosive, compared to 600 pounds in a depth charge. They didn't create spectacular explosions. They weren't intimidating to look at, but they worked. They sank U-boats at 11 times the rate of depth charges per attack. That was all that mattered. The human cost of the Battle of the Atlantic was immense. Of approximately 40,000 German U-boat crew members who served during the war, 30,000 died, a casualty rate of 75%, the highest of any military service in any nation during World War II. The men who died were not necessarily ideological fanatics. Many were career sailors who had joined the Navy in the 1930s. Others were conscripts assigned to U-boat service. They were mechanics, engineers, radio operators, torpedo men. They fought in the most claustrophobic, dangerous environment imaginable, submerged in steel tubes, hundreds of feet underwater, hunted by destroyers, aircraft, and technologies they didn't understand. When their submarines were hit, death came through flooding, explosion, implosion, or drowning in darkness. Few U-boat crews survived their submarine's loss. Krankenhagen's crew aboard U-549 represented the statistical norm. All killed. No survivors, no graves, just names on casualty lists and families who never learned exactly how. Their sons, husbands, fathers, and brothers died. Allied losses in the Battle of the Atlantic were also severe. Over 3,500 merchant ships sunk, 175 Allied warships sunk, approximately 72,000 Allied sailors and merchant seamen were killed. The cargo lost. Millions of tons of food, fuel, equipment, and munitions affected Britain's ability to sustain its war effort and delayed Allied offensives. The human suffering on both sides was real and profound. But by May 1944, when U-549 encountered Elmore's Hedgehog, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. The statistics were clear. In 1943, Allied shipbuilding had finally exceeded U-boat sinking rates. By 1944, the margin was overwhelming. American shipyards alone were producing Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. Escort carriers provided air cover over convoy routes, previously beyond land-based aircraft range. Hunter-killer groups actively hunted U-boats rather than waiting for them to attack convoys. Code breaking revealed U-boat positions and intentions, and weapons like the Hedgehog made anti-submarine attacks deadly effective. German U-boats continued operations through the end of the war, but their effectiveness collapsed. In 1945, U-boats sank fewer than 50 Allied ships while losing over 150 submarines. The kill ratio had reversed completely. U-boats went from hunters to hunted, from predators controlling vast ocean areas to prey desperately trying to survive each patrol. The psychological shift was total. U-boat crews in 1942 had believed they were winning the war. U-boat crews in 1945 knew they were dying for a lost cause. Some continued fighting from discipline or loyalty. Some hoped that new technology, the Type 21 electroboats with their high submerged speed and improved batteries, might turn the tide. It didn't. The war ended before enough Type 21s entered service to affect the outcome. The lessons of the Hedgehog's development and employment remained relevant long after World War II ended. Military organizations are inherently conservative. They develop doctrine based on past experience and resist changing that doctrine until forced by evidence. The British Admiralty initially resisted the Hedgehog despite its demonstrated superiority over depth charges. Royal Navy captains preferred the familiar weapon, even when statistics proved the new weapon was more effective. Only direct orders and extensive retraining overcame that institutional inertia. American adoption was faster, partly because American destroyer escorts were new construction designed around integrated anti-submarine systems rather than older ships being retrofitted. But even in the United States Navy, full integration of sonar and Hedgehog fire control required time, training, and command emphasis. Technology alone didn't win. Technology combined with doctrine, training, and institutional will to change won. The second lesson was about the relationship between sensors and weapons. The Hedgehog's effectiveness came not from its explosive power, but from its integration with continuous sonar tracking. The weapon was designed specifically to complement the sensor. It allowed the sensor to function continuously during attacks. This sensor-weapon integration became fundamental to post-war military systems. Modern missile defense systems, precision-guided munitions, and networked warfare all build on the same principle. Sensors detect and track. Weapons engage based on sensor data. The loop between detection and engagement is closed as tightly as possible. The Hedgehog was one of the first weapons designed explicitly around that principle. The third lesson was about the importance of systematic feedback and improvement. The Hedgehog's initial kill rate of 5% could have been dismissed as a failed weapon. Instead, analysis determined the problem was training and doctrine, not the weapon itself. Correcting those problems increased effectiveness dramatically. Organizations that learn from feedback and adapt accordingly outperform organizations that blame failure on external factors or abandon new approaches at the first difficulty. For Captain Lieutenant Detlev Krankenhagen and his 57 crew members, these lessons came too late. They died not knowing they were demonstrating principles that would shape naval warfare for the next 80 years. They died believing they were fighting the same war their predecessors had fought in 1942, but the war had changed. The weapons had changed. The tactics had changed, and they never understood how completely the balance had shifted until the moment when 3 Hedgehog projectiles struck U-549's hull and the ocean began flooding in at hundreds of gallons per minute. That was when doctrine met reality, when belief met evidence, when the 45 seconds of descending projectiles proved insufficient to comprehend how thoroughly the rules had changed. Modern warfare does not announce its revolutions. It doesn't provide warning that old methods no longer work. It simply kills those who fail to adapt and moves on. Krankenhagen was an experienced, competent U-boat commander. His attack on Block Island was executed perfectly. His initial evasion was textbook. But textbook solutions written for 1942 were obsolete in 1944, and obsolescence in combat is fatal. The Hedgehog remained in service with the United States Navy through the 1960s, eventually replaced by ASROC anti-submarine rockets and homing torpedoes. The Royal Navy replaced it with the Squid and later the Limbo mortar systems. Modern anti-submarine warfare uses sophisticated sonobuoys, dipping sonar from helicopters, variable depth, towed array sonars, and homing torpedoes launched from aircraft, ships, and submarines. The technologies have advanced enormously, but the principles established by the Hedgehog, continuous sensor tracking integrated with forward-throwing weapons and contact fuses, remain fundamental. The basic concept that information enables precision and precision defeats evasion has not changed. The technology implementing that concept has become vastly more sophisticated. But the underlying truth that knowing where your enemy is and hitting that exact location defeats even the most skilled evasion was proven in the North Atlantic between 1942 and 1945, one Hedgehog attack at a time. U-549 lies approximately 300 miles northwest of the Canary Islands, in water roughly 2,000 feet deep. The wreck has never been located or surveyed. Somewhere in that darkness rests a Type 1C-40 U-boat with the remains of 57 men who died believing they were fighting World War II submarine warfare, the way it had always been fought. They never understood they were fighting a new kind of war where the rules had changed so fundamentally that experience and skill offered no protection. The Hedgehog projectiles that killed them represented not just technological advancement, but doctrinal evolution. The weapon itself was simple: steel projectiles with contact fuses. But the system that weapon-enabled, continuous tracking, and precision engagement was revolutionary. That revolution killed Krankenhagen and his crew not because they were incompetent, but because they were trained for a different war. The war they thought they were fighting ended in 1943. The war that actually existed in May 1944 had moved beyond their understanding. The 45 seconds between the Hedgehogs entering the water and the impacts on U-549's hull were not enough time to bridge that gap. They never are. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.